Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 7 of the course. Maybe right away you notice that I've shrunk the frame of this PowerPoint presentation that I'm recording a bit. Hopefully that'll make it easier to process and upload. Okay, besides that, the first thing I want to say is that I've had a few of you reach out to me to express that you're feeling overwhelmed right now. This is a hard semester. For many of you, myself included, doing this remotely takes an incredible amount of work, far more than doing it in person, and we have no breaks. So, as I've tried to balance the need to make sure that we can really meet the objectives of this course while maintaining our sanity, I've decided to combine weeks 10 and 11. So remember, we're in week 7, so this isn't going to happen for a little bit yet. But the reason I want to combine those 2 weeks is that the readings for those weeks have considerable overlap in both their content and their theoretical approaches. So they deal with politics of remembering World War II in Germany and the USSR. And I will combine those 2 weeks into a single presentation and allow you to do the focus questions for either the Thomas Wolfe reading that's posted on Banco Hall or the Wolf Konsteiner reading that's also posted on Banco Hall. You're not required to do both, one or the other. If you do both, I will give you extra credit equivalent to 1 week's worth of focus questions. There will also only be one discussion board for weeks 10 and 11. So you can basically have a break from this class during one of those 2 weeks. So working in lighter workload days is essentially something that the SUNY system and our own administration has encouraged all of us to do. So I'm going to be doing that, not right away, but know that you've got a little bit of a breather on the horizon. Okay, so let me shrink myself down. This mouse is being problematic. Here we are in World War One, and the lecture today is titled "Putting the World into World War One." Uh, oops, let's move ahead. Having trouble there. Okay, I'll keep myself out of it. All right, so last week I proposed that we reframe histories of the 20th century by making the experience of colonialism go from being sort of peripheral to the main stories of quote unquote Western civilization to being front and center, to being the main story. So this type of perspective is sometimes called decolonizing history, taking those things that had been hidden, that had been forgotten, and remembering them. So I want you to keep that perspective in mind as we consider World War One this week. So histories of World War One, they typically begin with what you've got on this page right here, with the assassination of the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie. So the metaphor spark that ignited the powder keg is rather apt here. The spark is far less important than the keg full of powder waiting to explode. It was kind of a strange spark to choose as well. The Habsburg Archduke was assassinated in Sarajevo, which, as part of Bosnia, had been formally incorporated into the Habsburg Empire only since 1907. His killer, Gavrilo Princip, was an ethnic Serb who wanted Bosnia to join Serbia. He was not from Serbia, and he didn't have anything to do with the government of Serbia, though was possibly connected to a Serbian secret military organization, but probably not. I mean, he was a 19-year-old kid. A proper investigation by the Austro-Hungarians in Bosnia, which never happened, might have found that out. Yet, just 2 weeks after the assassination, the Austro-Hungarian government sent an ultimatum to Serbia, again, a country that had nothing to do with it, demanding, among other things, to allow Austrians to monitor the work of the Serbian government in rooting out organizations that were hostile to Austria, to cease teaching of propaganda harmful to Austrian interests, and to find all perpetrators of the assassination. They had 48 hours to respond. Again, the killer wasn't from Serbia, so the Serbs naturally refused. And 2 weeks after this ultimatum, the Austro-Hungarians invaded Serbia, beginning the First World War. So, getting back to the metaphor, spark that lit the powder keg, as we think about histories of World War One, it's again less the spark that matters and more how people have understood the powder in the more than 100 years since the end of the war. So at the time of World War One, explanations for the war, or its powder, often focused on German militarism, Serbian insolence, or French and English trickery, basically blaming whoever one was fighting. Over the last 100 years, explanations for the war have shifted wildly, and this is where perspective really matters. So, in the aftermath of the war, the focus of many histories remained nationalistic, but more serious scholars look to the system of secret alliances and militarism. In these explanations of the war, it was the fault of modern societies, a war that essentially just happened, an accident that in the modern world might repeat itself at any time. Think about how depressing and terrifying such a perspective would have been. This despondency informs so much of the better literature and art in the post war period as well. So after World War II, then, the idea of nationalism became a much more prominent explanation for the war, as another war driven by extreme nationalism had just occurred, World War II. Many of you, and I'm really glad you did, chose nationalism as a key 19th century ideology in your discussion board posts last week. Your week 5 discussion board posts were amazing. I haven't looked at your week 6 ones yet. Okay, so over the last few decades, though, another perspective to the war has gained traction, the colonial one. So in this explanation, you basically have the colonial losers, hemmed in Austria, the Ottomans, colonially weak Germany, uniting against the colonial winners, especially France, England, and ever-expanding Russia. The Portuguese and Italians joined with the colonial winners as they hoped to increase their African empires, and in the case of Italy, land in Europe as well, at the expense of the Central Powers. So the millions of colonial people who fought and died in this conflict or who were slaughtered in genocides and starvation campaigns become much more important in these perspectives rather than peripheral or whitewashed out of the histories as they were from 1914 to 1918 and for decades thereafter. So looking at the colonial perspective is not a new explanation either. Socialists, they were using it as an explanation ever since the war started. Vladimir Lenin even published a pamphlet denouncing the war in 1916 called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. So in the next few slides, and you know that denouncing the war wasn't the only purpose of that pamphlet. But anyway, so in the next few slides, I want to touch on some different areas of the world where people died in this conflict and think about how each of these theaters of conflict fits into the types that I've outlined on this slide. And I want to emphasize that there is value to all of these explanations. All right, let's start by looking at explanations that were dominant at the time. So the Austro-Hungarian, oh, whoops, I'm in the wrong slide. Okay. So the Austro-Hungarian attack on Serbia was absolutely disgusting, but it was motivated by so many people in the empire feeling as if the Serbs had insulted them, especially Austrians, for whom this was an exercise in nationalism. Within a few months, the Austrians fully occupied Serbia. The Serb army retreated through Albania and Greece, regrouped, and came back in late 1918. Austrians, who were multi-ethnic, it was a large empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had many soldiers who were Croatians who spoke the same language as the Serbs. They also had Czechs, Slovaks, and Slovenes who didn't have too much difficulty figuring out the language. Uh, these soldiers, as they occupied Serbia, they took thousands of civilian hostages, and they would execute between 10 and 100 civilians for every Austro-Hungarian soldier killed by resistors. By the end of the war, through starvation and brutality, 1 million people, or 27% of the population of Serbia, had been killed. The Allied powers were well aware of Austro-Hungarian brutality, and for many, especially the Serbian army, this motivated their willingness to fight against the Central Powers. It motivated people farther away, too. In 1917, shortly after the U.S. got involved in the war, the United States government declared a national day of prayer for Serbia. So, let's look at another explanation for the war. The war that just happened, especially because of a system of secret alliances. You might wonder why this system of alliances would have so easily led to war. One reason was that mobilization plans, both French and German, were based off the lessons of the Franco-Prussian War, where military planners felt or thought that quick mobilization was key to victory or defeat if you didn't mobilize quick enough. So this map shows the German Schlieffen Plan, which had been official German military policy since 1907, which anticipated that in the case of war, Germans would have to fight on two fronts against France and Russia, because France and Russia were locked in an alliance. To win this war, German planners thought they would need to immediately attack France through neutral Belgium, knock them out, then turn against Russia, which was still underdeveloped and would take more time to mobilize. What's horrifying about this plan is that they were willing to attack France and Belgium first, even without a declaration of war. When actually put into practice in August 1914, the Germans were met by French and British resistance. They spent until October trying to outflank each other all along here in northern France and the south of Belgium as they raced to the sea. It's actually called the race to the sea. So and as they tried to outflank each other, they basically dug trenches all the way to the sea across northern France. So this line of trenches would move very little over the next 4 years on the Western Front, where 11 million people would die. So in the middle of 1916, the French and British unleashed a joint operation meant to finally break the stalemate on the Western Front. There would be many battles like the Somme, meant to change the outcome of the Western Front. The Somme just happens to be the bloodiest of them. So for 5 days before the battle began, French and British forces fired almost 2 million shells at German lines. They also planted enormous explosives underneath the German trenches, tunneling. And then on July 1st, 1916, at 6 a.m., with military precision, they then began sending people over the top. Over the next several months, roughly 1 million people on all sides of the battle lost their lives. The French and British commands hailed it as a stunning success. They had pushed the front forward 7 miles. To humanize things a little, you might consider the Newfoundland Regiment, which had roughly 700 men in the fight. In the first 15 minutes, 324 of them were killed. Many more were wounded as the first day dragged on. Only 68 were fit enough to answer roll call the next day. So, as we're getting into more recent history, I'd like to encourage you to share stories you have in our discussion board posts or through emails of family members who were part of the events and dynamics that we're covering. I'm really trying to cover the entire world and to cover people from all walks of life, all social classes, all backgrounds, and I'm interested in how your parents, how your grandparents, how you yourselves, when we get towards the end of the semester, fit into these dynamics. So this person right here is not he's my wife's great grandfather, George Whitley. So I want to tell you a little bit about George. So George didn't join the military in 1914. He was 36 at the time and a single father of 4 children, all of whom were under the age of 10. His wife had recently died. He was also a streetcar driver in Leeds, England. So his age, his children, and his essential occupation all made him a low priority for conscription until early 1916. By 1916, an entire generation of young British, French, and German men, children, essentially, had been killed in the trenches of France and other theaters that we'll get to as well. So in April 1916, George received his conscription notice. He was 38 at the time. He had to work out an arrangement with his neighbor to take care of his kids, and he sent her all of his army pay. So after a brief training stint, George was sent to France, and his very first engagement was the Battle of the Somme. Early in this 4-month-long battle, he received notice that his oldest daughter, who was now 11, had been run over by a car and killed. He tried to get leave to go back and help his family, but was denied because he was in the middle of the Battle of the Somme. So George survived this battle without any physical injuries, and yet so many of his compatriots did not. The Yorkshire regiments, in total, he was a part of one of them, suffered horrifically. 8,000 people from Yorkshire regiments alone were killed on the very first day of the battle. Uh, George was eventually diagnosed with shell shock that November, and he was sent to a military hospital in Scotland. Then, after they deemed him ready, he was returned to frontline fighting in 1917. He didn't make it home until 1919, by which time he had already been forced to send his next oldest child, who happens to be my wife's grandpa, Tom to live with relatives in faraway Saskatchewan, all figuring this out, by letter writing from the trenches. So what he went through, as horrible as it sounds, was mild compared to what millions of people suffered across Europe, the Middle East, East and Central Africa, Southeast Asia, the Atlantic Ocean, and of course, uh, so many families in North America as well. So another one of the unimaginably ghastly fronts of this war was on the border between Austria, Hungary, and Italy in the Julian Alps. In 1916, Italians joined the war on the side of the Allies, rather cynically with the hope to gain territory from Austria-Hungary should the Allies win. Nationalism makes a lot of sense as a narrative strategy to describe this part of World War I. The territory that Italians wanted was the city of Trieste, the western part of modern-day Slovenia, and bits of the Croatian coast. Basically, they wanted all those multi-ethnic areas that were once part of the Venetian Empire. They would get most of it. Mussolini would take more, and then they would lose most of it after World War II. If all of this sounds silly, just be aware that 2 million people, roughly 1 million on each side, died in this absolutely nonsensical conflict for territory and national prestige. Ernest Hemingway was there too as an ambulance driver. So the bulk of Italian and Austro-Hungarian fighting occurred in a series of battles around the Sonzo River. It's called the Socha in Slovene, where ethnic Germans, Italians, Croatians, and Slovenes were often fighting mere miles from their homes. Civilians living in these otherwise picturesque mountain areas remembered years of not being able to sleep at night because of the never-ending shells raining down death. I used to know a woman from Kranj, Slovenia. She died in 2004, whose father was part of this battle. She remembers going to a hospital on the front after he was wounded in 1917 and watching him slowly die until doctors shooed her out of the room. She was just a young girl at the time. Her husband then was later killed in the German army fighting on the Russian front in World War II. So just about every time I visited her, she would recount these two stories, then lament the effing German armies that killed all the men in her life. For her, the nationalism was very alive and well. She would sometimes add that her son and grandkids were all Slovenes and would never have to die for such nationalism. They would never have to die for Germans again, since they had their own country now. On the Eastern Front, so much of the conflict acted as a prelude to World War II. In fact, the conflict in the eastern regions of Poland and western parts of Ukraine, Belarus, way down to Moldova, would be almost unending between 1914 and the early 1950s. So some of the conflicts of the First World War seem almost mild by comparison to these later conflicts, in large part because the interwar conflicts would so frequently target civilians in ethnic cleansing campaigns, nationalism at its worst. But in 1914, the Russians actually mobilized a lot faster than the Germans thought they would be able to, and they had some early victories, especially against areas they wanted, like the Galicia province of Austria-Hungary. The capital city of Galicia, Lviv, Lvov, or Lemberg, depending on your language, would change hands a few times during the war. When the Russians occupied Lviv, which is the name of the city today, they tried to dispel the terrible reputation they had developed among Poles in their empire by actually working to administer the city well, perhaps better than they were administering cities in Russia. They spoke often of the Piedmont principle, which they had learned from the Italians that we talked about last week, who unified because they all wanted to join a state as successful as Sardinia and Piedmont. The Russians hoped that they could encourage other Poles and Ukrainians to want to join the Russian Empire as well. Lviv was a particularly tragic city as the population was roughly divided into thirds, one-third Polish, one-third Ukrainian, one-third Jewish, with a sizable German minority as well. Okay, my bad math there. But it wasn't divided into quarters. So this diversity was perfectly fine under the centuries of Polish-Lithuanian rule, but by the 20th century, that kind of diversity in a continent plagued by nationalism had unfortunately become a liability. So as Russians began to lose more broadly in terrible battles like Tannenberg, where their losses far outweighed the Germans, places like Lviv were taken by the Austrians, and I've got some data on this slide, of course. Um, So were taken by the Austrians, retaken by the Russians, taken by the Germans, then eventually given to the newly independent state of Poland, which fought a bitter battle with the Western Ukrainian People's Republic for control of the city after the war. The war would become hugely unpopular in Russia, and part of the Bolshevik Party's eventual popularity was promising people land, bread, and most importantly, peace. So in the summer of 1917, as the interim Kerensky government, which had overthrown the Tsar in February 1917, tried to manage things, the only thing that kept the other allies hopeful was the entry of the United States of America into World War I. Next week, we'll spend a good amount of time on the Russian Revolution. So the Wilson administration in the United States had been pushing for entry into the war ever since they had started campaigning in 1915. There were a few turning points that later historians would look at, like the sinking of the passenger ship Lusitania, which was also carrying military supplies to the British. Another particularly interesting turning point occurred in 1917 when the Zimmermann telegram was intercepted, a German communication asking that if the U.S. wouldn't remain neutral, Mexico would declare war on the United States with Germany, and Germany would agree to Mexico regaining territory lost to the U.S. during the Mexican American War. This outraged Americans, who, at the time this telegram was printed in the press, still had troops engaged in hunting down Pancho Villa inside of Mexico. Anti-Mexican sentiments were strong in the U.S., and it seems those sentiments were what it took to push the U.S. over the edge into wanting war. In January of 1918, then, so the U.S. entered in April 1917, but in January of 1918, Wilson outlined his vision for lasting peace in his 14-point speech, and that's one of your supplemental readings for this week. You've got a couple focus questions based on the 14 points. So he hoped for, among other things, national self-determination in Europe, or that borders would be redrawn by referendum to form nation states, free commerce on the open seas, an end to secret treaties. This was ultimately the framework of the League of Nations. And number 14, for an independent country called Poland to exist. Polish American voters in Chicago and Pennsylvania were kind of key to his election. So too were Serbs, Croatians, Slovenes, Czechs, and Slovaks, for whom the post-war countries of Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia seemed ample rewards for supporting Wilson as president. In this war, roughly 80,000 Americans died, far less than other countries, but the American contribution of 3 million fighters to primarily the Western Front was enough to push the Allies over the edge and win what had become a long stalemate. Oops, I hit my mouse. Oh, here we are. Here we are. Sorry about that. All right. So I want to shift to Middle Eastern theaters of the war. So while Western histories of Middle Eastern conflicts for years often focused on the daring exploits of people like Lawrence of Arabia, the real tragedy Lawrence of Arabia worked with Hashemite and Saudi tribes to basically get them to rise up against the Ottoman Empire and help them to eventually be able to get independent states, Jordan and Saudi Arabia. But anyways, the real tragedy of the Middle East was in the losses, the horrific losses in the civilian populations, where lack of transportation caused massive famine. So in Syria, roughly 1/4 of the population starved to death during the war simply from lack of reliable transportation networks for food supply lines. Farther north, inside of what is today Turkey and the country of Armenia, fanatical young Turks working. The Young Turks was the political party that we mentioned with regards to the Balkan Wars last week. So the Young Turk Party, working within the Ottoman military administration, carried out the intentional destruction or genocide of Armenian populations in eastern Turkey. Through long forced marches, mass murder, and intentional starvation, 1.5 million Armenians, or roughly half of the world population of Armenians at the time, were killed in the year 1915. This Young Turk political party would go on to found the Republic of Turkey after the war. The government of Turkey has yet to even recognize that this happened. People regularly lose their jobs in Turkey for being willing to admit that there even was a genocide more than 100 years ago. So, in Western histories, another theater on the Ottoman front that's often remembered is the failed attempt to take the Dardanelles, the Gallipoli battle, where hundreds of thousands of people died uh, to, from the Ottoman perspective, successfully defend the gateway to Constantinople and resupply route to Russia. Or from the British, including large numbers of Australians and New Zealanders, and French perspectives, a senseless waste of hundreds of thousands of lives for a failed objective. So by 1918, the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires would be dismantled. Such provisions were included in Wilson's 14 points. In the Arabic-speaking regions of the Middle East, British agents worked to encourage resistance. The House of Saud and the Hashemites were happy to comply. So too were people in Palestine. Early in the war, it was decided that England's role over Egypt would continue and Palestine would become a British mandate as well, a term meaning temporary colonial control to help the country towards independence, which was very problematic for people in much of the Middle East who said, actually, we're ready for independence right now. So the British would also remain in control of Aden, which is now part of Yemen, Sudan, the Gulf states, and Iraq, while the French would control Syria and Lebanon, as well as have recognition over their other African and Asian colonial holdings. So one of your readings for this week by Santanu Duse really gets at the unsung, even forcibly whitewashed histories of the millions of colonial and semi-colonial subjects who served in this war. African Americans, of whom more than 300,000 served, were treated similarly to colonial soldiers. So many of these people never received recognition or compensation for their service. Some tried to get pensions and rather overwhelmingly failed. And yet they're the ones who put the term world into World War. So to repeat a point I started with, if you consider the colonial world, when the wars that are traditionally taught as part of Western history in the 20th century, um, they suddenly make a lot more sense as part of one contiguous conflict, because imperialism and its discontents provide context to these many conflicts. World War I is less a competition between nationalisms or a consequence of militarization or even the result of a foolhardy alliance system. It's a clash of colonialisms. It's a clash between the colonial winners and the colonial losers. The world's premier imperialist nations, France, England, and Russia, fought against the dwindling imperialist powers of the Ottoman and Habsburg empires, along with the upstart Germans. And giving a colonial perspective especially changes one's view of a country like Belgium. So Belgium, in a colonial perspective, seems a lot less like the country of helpless victims whose neutrality was violated by the Germans, and more like a premier colonial power responsible for the deaths of millions of Africans. We read about King Leopold last week. The Belgian government was officially in control of Congo by the time of World War I, and yet in Congo they raised the Congolese Force Publique, which fought ferociously in Africa against the Germans, and they they were also responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Africans. The Germans, too, were responsible for horrific atrocities, both during the war and previously, such as the Herero genocide in German Southwest Africa in 1904, where as many as 100,000 people were murdered. So, decolonizing these perspectives changes a lot of things. American involvement seems less motivated by Woodrow Wilson's post-imperialist view. I mean, not less motivated. That's still important, but this post-imperialist worldview is complicated by the fact that at the time the United States entered World War I, the U.S. was occupying Haiti, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Hawaii, the American West, and American forces at the time of their declaration of war were still involved in the pursuit of Pancho Villa in Mexico without Mexican consent. So the war ended with an armistice on November 11th at 11:11 a.m. 1918. The Versailles Treaty was finalized several months after this armistice, and the Versailles Treaty, from multiple perspectives, has long been considered a failure, depending on the perspective one takes to narrate the war. So, for those who felt the war was the fault of the other, the the treaty didn't go far enough in punishing the Central Powers. While Wilson hoped to implement his 14 points, Georges Clemenceau of France, whose country lost 8% of its population in the war, felt German aggression needed to be punished or justice would never be served. Oh, there's my face. Came back. Oh, you can have my face in the corner. Um, those of you who really like having my face in the presentations, I apologize. Okay, so Germans were prevented from rearming fully and were saddled with such crippling reparations that their economy free fell into the hyperinflation of the early Weimar Republic, where a loaf of bread cost a wheelbarrow full of money. For nationalists, the provisions of the Paris Peace Treaty to divide Europe according to national self-determination was an abysmal failure. Next week, we'll deal with the widespread violence that I've already hinted at in Lithuania, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Austria, Yugoslavia, Italy, Romania, Hungary, Germany, Bulgaria, Greece, Albania, and Turkey that occurred between the wars. A colonial perspective, though, on the Treaty of Versailles is even more telling. So many representatives of colonized and unrecognized territories showed up at the Paris Peace Conference and were rebuffed. Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam was there. Basques came. Many representatives of African peoples tried to come. So too did Middle Easterners. They were all denied a seat at the table. But the fact that millions of Africans, Indians, Chinese people, and African Americans participated in this war meant that many of them felt like they should have some of these rights too. That they who were fighting to make the world safe for democracy deserved democracy at home as well. And many hundreds of thousands of these people fought in Africa too. In particular, I mentioned the 20,000 Congolese who fought for the for the Belgians. So, despite not playing a role in Versailles, after this treaty, anti-colonial movements blossomed around the world. The role of African Americans was key to the early development of a global anti-imperialist consciousness too, especially those people who benefited from the Harlem Renaissance and the vibrant black presses in the US. Using this cultural capital as a springboard, thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois began to tie the struggle of African Americans to the global struggle of people of color under colonialism. So, while denied a seat in Versailles, Du Bois organized a Pan-African Congress in Paris in 1919, demanding that Africans be given pathways to self-rule. The Soviets would then hold a similar conference in Baku, which is now part of Azerbaijan, a year later, called the Congress of the Peoples of the East. We'll talk about some more of these in a couple of weeks, and especially get into some of the really vibrant women's movements that would become crucial between the 1930s and the 1950s in bringing about independence. So, but one consequence of the early whitewashing of World War I history was to motivate so many of the veterans who had secured the Allied victory to begin to mobilize for democracy in their own lands, which would unfortunately take decades of conflict to achieve. So, all right, I hope that this wide-ranging, worldwide view of World War I helps give you some inspiration as you tackle your discussion board posts for this week. And remember, too, that there will be another paper due in this class, so if there's anything in these presentations that really piques your interest, make sure to check the footnotes in my presentation notes in the script, and feel free to research that topic further for your final paper. So, all right, these are the bonus questions. Because of my goofy formatting and trying to have a perfect square this week, I had to put them on 2 different pages. So, and again, you can just look at the PowerPoint on Vanco Hall. So, all right, I hope you all have a good week, and I'll talk to you later.